When I try to explain my life to people now, I always feel the need to begin with a room, because for a long time I thought my story was about clothes when it was really about the rooms in which other people looked at me and decided who I was before I knew how to answer them. The first room I remember clearly was my grandmother's back bedroom, the one that smelled faintly of face powder, starch, and the roses she kept in a little glass bowl with no water, just because she liked how they looked when they dried. I was very small enough that my feet did not touch the floor when she sat me on the bedspread, and my mother stood behind me with a brush, pulling it carefully through my hair while my grandmother watched with a kind of pleased concentration that made me feel as though I were part of a task they both knew how to do. "Hold still," my mother would say, and I would, because the truth is I always held still when women were gentle with me. That morning I remember the cool touch of a barrette against my temple, the way my mother tucked the longer strands away from my eyes, and the soft approving sound my grandmother made. No one asked me whether I wanted my hair clipped back that way. No one asked me much of anything in those years. I was the youngest child in a family that had long since learned the habit of deciding for one another. My sisters had already been dressed, brushed, corrected, and guided into themselves before I could even speak in full sentences, and I was folded into that same stream without anyone stopping to name how unusual it might look from the outside. To them, I think, it was not a strange beginning. It was just family life. I grew up in a house run by women's rhythms. My father was present, but never in the way my mother was. He worked long hours, left before daylight, came home carrying the smell of the road and machine oil, and by the time he sat down at the table the whole tone of the house changed, as if we all adjusted our breathing without meaning to. But the real texture of our days belonged to my mother, my two older sisters, and, depending on the season, a rotating cast of aunts, cousins, and my grandmother, who treated our home and hers as if a single invisible hallway connected them. There was always laundry being folded, hems being pinned, a kettle being boiled, a birthday being planned, a hurt feeling being discussed in the kitchen when the men had gone out. My sisters were 6 and 8 years older than I was, old enough that by the time my memory sharpened, they seemed less like siblings and more like weather systems. They knew things. They knew which drawer held ribbons and which one held buttons that no longer matched anything but might be useful someday. They knew how to tell, from the sound of our mother's footsteps, whether she was tired or upset or in a good mood. They knew how to lean over me and straighten a collar with a decisiveness that made resistance feel both pointless and somehow rude. At first, I do not think anyone was trying to make a statement with me. We were not a dramatic family, whatever the title of my story might suggest. We were practical, habit-driven people who covered awkward truths with jokes and called control by softer names. If one of my sisters outgrew a cardigan and it looked tidy enough, I wore it around the house. If my mother said my hair was too pretty to shear off and besides it kept my ears warm in winter, then it stayed long. If my aunt laughed and said I looked like the third daughter in a family photograph, then everyone laughed with her, and I learned, before I had language for embarrassment, that a room full of people could settle on an identity for you in under a second and expect you to stand there smiling while it happened. When I was very little, I smiled because I always smiled when adults looked pleased. Later, I smiled because not smiling would have made things heavier. The strange thing is that my earliest confusion did not feel like pain. It felt like warmth mixed with watchfulness. My sisters would sit me at the foot of their bed while they got ready for school dances or church services, and they would chatter over my head as if I were both mascot and apprentice. One would hold up 2 sweaters and ask which looked better, and when I pointed, she would tell me I had a better eye than most boys. The other would use me to pass her bobby pins and then, almost absent-mindedly, tuck one into my own hair to keep it from falling into my face while I helped. I was included in their softness before I knew softness had borders. There was no single moment when somebody announced, "You're going to be raised differently." It happened through repetitions so ordinary they barely seemed worth noticing. Sit with your knees together.
Keep your voice down.
That color suits you. Don't ruin your hands climbing that fence. Come help us in the kitchen. Let your sister show you how to tie that scarf properly. Stand up straight. Smile for the photo. You look so nice when you make an effort. Each sentence was small by itself, and because they were spoken with affection, I accepted them more deeply than I accepted anything harsh. My father noticed in flashes, as men often notice the things they refuse to watch closely. He would come home after being gone for 2 days and stop in the doorway, taking in my hair, the neatness of my clothes, the way I lingered near the women instead of bolting outside. Sometimes he only shook his head and called me Mama's little shadow. Sometimes he said I ought to spend more time with boys my age, or that my sisters needed to stop fussing over me. But he said these things in the irritated tone of a man protesting rain, not in the steady tone of a man committed to changing the weather. My mother had a way of answering him that sounded casual, but ended every argument. "He's fine," she would say while wiping a plate or pinning a sleeve. "Leave him be." And because my father's deepest habit was absence, he usually did leave me be. Looking back, I think a different kind of father might have cut through everything and forced a more brutal choice, but mine lived in a twilight of discomfort and surrender. He knew something about me unsettled him, and he also knew the women of our family had claimed me in ways he had never learned to challenge for long. School was where other people's eyes first became sharp enough to hurt. Section, though I later learned it was not. It was plain, navy blue, nothing bright or dramatic, but the cut of it sat differently on me than on the other boys' shirts, and I stared at my shoulders as if shape alone could explain the feeling of being misread by everyone at once. I was too young then to think, maybe they are seeing something true. All I knew was that I felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with skin. It was as if everybody else had received a map to a place I was expected to live, and I had somehow missed the lesson. My mother's answer to my distress was always presentation. If I came home after a hard day, withdrawn and red-eyed, she did not ask many direct questions. She would smooth my hair back from my forehead, straighten my collar, tell me not to hunch, tell me not to let people see they had gotten to me. She believed deeply in the power of composure, especially for children who did not fit neatly into the world. I do not know whether she understood what she was doing, or whether she only knew instinctively that neatness could become a kind of armor. "If they stare, give them something polished to stare at," she once told me while buttoning a coat for church. It was a very female piece of wisdom, though she would never have called it that. It was survival passed down through tone and gesture. She did not teach me how to be a boy. She taught me how to be scrutinized without collapsing. My sisters, without intending to, made things more complicated by loving me exactly where I was most unsure. They never treated my softness as a flaw. If anything, they exaggerated it into identity before I had agreed to own it. They brought me into their games long after boys were supposed to stop wanting in. If they played house with younger cousins, I was assigned a role beside them, often not as the father or brother, but as another daughter, another cousin, another figure in a world arranged by dresses, blankets, dishes, and moods. When I protested, which I sometimes did only because I knew I was supposed to, they would laugh and say I was no good at pretending to be anything else. It infuriated me because I feared they were right. I was clumsy when I tried to imitate roughness. I did not know how to wear indifference convincingly. Even when I got older and more self-conscious, I still found myself drifting toward the women at family gatherings, helping carry plates, listening to conversations from doorways, feeling more natural among their layered feelings than I ever did among the louder certainties of my uncles. Extended family can shape a child as much through repeated comments as through any deliberate act. My Aunt Denise liked to say I had been borrowed from the daughter's side of the family. My grandmother said I had delicate hands and should learn to take care of them because people always notice hands. A cousin once braided my hair at a picnic because she was bored, and when an uncle laughed, my grandmother snapped at him with such sudden coldness that everyone fell quiet. "He's a child," she said. "Let him be looked after." At the time, I heard only the relief of being protected. Years later, I understood that she was defending not just my innocence, but a vision of me that the women around me had silently agreed upon. They did not always use feminine words, and when they did it was often teasing, deniable, half-playful. But there was a way they placed me in their world that was neither accidental nor temporary. They corrected my manners in one direction. They praised certain kinds of beauty in me and ignored others. They encouraged a delicacy that most families would have trained out of a boy by second grade. I wish I could say I understood myself early and only lacked courage, but that would make for a cleaner story than the one I lived. The truth is that confusion was my first language. I did not know whether I wanted what they were giving me or whether I had simply been given it, so often I no longer knew where their wishes ended and mine began. There were mornings when I hated every hand that touched my collar or fixed my hair because I wanted the heavy, simple invisibility of other boys. There were afternoons when I caught sight of myself reflected in a shop window, hair tucked behind one ear, walking beside my mother and sisters, and felt something like longing so strong it embarrassed me. I could not have named that longing then. It was not for a particular garment or hairstyle. It was for coherence, for the relief of not having to split myself into what others saw and what I feared they might see if I stopped struggling. Church played its own quiet role in all of this. We were not zealots, but we were constant. Sunday meant polished shoes, ironed clothes, and the social theater of being observed by people who had known your family for generations. It was at church that I learned how much presentation could become destiny in the eyes of a community. Women would touch my cheek and say I looked lovely before correcting themselves with a little laugh. Men would ask my father whether he was ever going to cut my hair. I became used to the pause in people's faces, that flicker of recalculation when they took me in. Once, at a Christmas pageant, I was assigned to be an angel because the woman organizing costumes said my face was too gentle for a shepherd boy. Everyone found this charming except me. Or rather, I told myself I hated it because I knew I should. I wore the costume with misery all through rehearsal, but when the evening came and my mother adjusted the pale sash at my waist, I remember the look on her face more vividly than the costume itself. She did not look amused. She looked moved, proud, almost tender to the point of sadness, as if she were seeing not a joke but a truth she had been waiting years for me to stop resisting. I carried that look home inside me like a secret I did not consent to keep. When my sisters became teenagers and then young women, their relationship to me shifted. They were less playful, more proprietary. They did not dress me up for games anymore, but they became curators of my presentation in a subtler way. One taught me how to care for my hair properly because, in her words, if I was going to wear it long, I could not let it look neglected. The other showed me how different fabrics changed how a person moved, how some cuts made a body seem harsher, and some softened it. She said these things as if discussing weather or architecture, but I absorbed them with a seriousness that startled me. Boys were not supposed to receive that kind of education at home, yet there I was at 14 learning from my sister why some sweaters made me seem drawn and others made me seem almost luminous. She never said feminine. She never had to. That word hummed under countless ordinary conversations without being spoken. Puberty did not arrive for me as triumph or even as panic. It arrived as grief. The first time I heard my voice catch and roughen, I sat on the edge of the bathtub afterward and cried in a frightened, embarrassed silence because I did not know why the sound of myself changing felt like a loss. Hair appeared in places I had never thought about, and every new sign of becoming a man landed in me not with pride but with a distant, stunned sorrow, as though somebody were quietly dismantling a house I had not yet admitted I lived in. This was the period when my father became more openly agitated. He took one look at me one summer evening, standing in the kitchen in a soft pale shirt my mother had bought because it suited my coloring, and said, not loudly but with real anger, "He's old enough now. This has gone far enough." No one answered for a few seconds. I still remember the hum of the refrigerator, the click of a spoon against a mug. Then my mother said, "What has gone far enough?" And the question was so calm it frightened me more than shouting would have. My father muttered something about me not looking right, not acting right, not being helped by all this coddling. My oldest sister, who rarely challenged him directly, said, "He looks like himself." It was the first time anyone in my family had defended me in those exact words. I held on to them for years. Yet even then, I did not suddenly become brave. I tried, with the desperate sincerity of adolescence, to be what the world expected. I let my hair be cut shorter once. I asked for plainer clothes. I joined a sports club for half a season and dreaded every practice. I watched other boys for cues and copied their posture, their shrugging speech, the studied carelessness with which they wore themselves. I was not terrible at the performance, which almost made it worse. People rewarded me for it. Teachers seemed relieved. My father softened for a while. Even strangers stopped looking twice. But I felt myself disappearing under that relief. It was a thin, dull life. I remember coming home from one of those practices and catching my reflection in the hall mirror. Short hair, oversized athletic jacket, face flushed with effort. I looked not wrong, exactly, but abandoned, like a house after the furniture had been taken out. My mother saw me standing there and did not say a word. Later that evening, she left a folded cardigan on the back of my chair, one of my sister's old ones, charcoal gray and simple enough to pass without comment. No note, no conversation, only that gesture. I put it on after everyone had gone to bed and sat in the dark living room feeling both ashamed and steadied, like somebody pressing a hand between my shoulder blades and saying, very quietly, come back. People imagine transformation as visible drama, but mine happened in such small increments that for years I doubted it was happening at all. It was the accumulation of permissions and resistances, the slow adjustment of my own gaze. I began paying attention not only to what made me feel safe, but to what made me feel recognizably present. Certain clothes did that, though they were never outrageous. Softer lines, narrower fits, muted colors that made my face look less harsh to myself. Grooming mattered too, not for vanity, but for peace. When my eyebrows were left untamed, I felt strangely untidy. When my skin was rough, I felt armored in the wrong way. When my hair was growing again, I felt a quiet relief each time it touched my neck. My sisters treated all of this as normal, or perhaps more accurately, they normalized it for me so persistently that my shame had less room to root. My mother bought me things without making a spectacle of it. A scarf in winter that could have belonged to anyone but somehow felt meant for me. A coat with a cut so subtle no one else would notice, though I noticed immediately. A pair of shoes she said were comfortable and sensible, which they were, but they also made me stand differently, with less heaviness. The older I got, the more I understood that my family's force was not always the force of command. Sometimes it was the force of refusal. Their refusal to treat the gentleness in me as temporary, their refusal to let ridicule define me, their refusal to pretend they did not see what they saw. That could be a gift. It could also feel like a burden. There were days when I wished they would let me disappear into ordinary manhood without holding up these mirrors to me. My oldest sister once said, after I had spent weeks wearing shapeless clothes and speaking as little as possible, "You look miserable when you hide." I snapped at her in a way that shocked us both. I told her she did not know what hiding cost because she had never been born into the wrong expectation. She looked at me for a long time and said, very softly, maybe. But I know what it costs to watch you do it. That was one of the first times I understood that my life had not only been shaped by other people's ideas of me, but by their grief at my suffering. Love can be overbearing when it is afraid of losing you, even if it never says so plainly. There was no single revelation, no night when I stood before a mirror and suddenly named myself. The closer truth is that I kept circling the same recognition until it wore a path deep enough to stop denying. One winter, when I was about 19, my grandmother fell ill and had to move in with us for several months. Illness made her gentler in some ways and more direct in others. I helped her sort old drawers because her hands shook too much to do it alone. We went through photographs, letters, sewing notions, little pieces of family archaeology. In one envelope there were snapshots of me as a child at birthdays, church picnics, school events. In nearly every one I was standing with the women, leaning slightly toward them, as if by instinct. In some my hair was tied back. In others I was wearing clothes that at the time had been explained to me as practical or neat or just what was available, but which I could now see clearly had been chosen with intention. My grandmother held one picture for a long time. "You were happiest when people stopped correcting you," she said. I looked up so fast, I nearly dropped the stack in my lap. "What do you mean?" I asked. She shrugged, old and unsentimental even then. "I mean you were easier in yourself when no one pushed. Your mother saw it before anyone." I wanted to argue, to ask whether seeing was the same as deciding, whether being guided was the same as being known. But the truth of the photographs had already unsettled me. In picture after picture, the expression on my face was not humiliation. It was ease. By my early 20s, the world wanted declarations from me that I still did not know how to make. Friends moved into adult life with the confidence of people following instructions they had always understood. They dated, planned careers, put on suits for interviews, joked about settling down into husbands and fathers. I could mimic the outlines, but every future described to me in those terms felt like watching somebody else's life through thick glass. When I tried dating in the role expected of me, I felt not predatory or false exactly, but unmoored. Women I liked seemed to sense that something in me was withheld, not from lack of feeling but from lack of location. I did not know where to stand inside myself. Meanwhile, my family, especially the women, continued responding to me with a kind of steady patience that was almost more frightening than pressure. It implied time. It implied that they believed I would eventually arrive somewhere they had long been able to imagine. My father and I never had the dramatic confrontation some people expect when I tell parts of this story. Ours was slower and sadder. He carried disappointment like a private injury. Sometimes he made comments sharp enough to sting. More often he simply looked away. As I grew older, I realized he was not only angry at me, but ashamed of his own helplessness. He had no language for a child who did not move toward manhood with gratitude. He knew only that the household he had never fully governed had shaped me in ways he could neither endorse nor reverse. Near the end of his life, after years of distance and a silence that had worn itself into routine, he once said to me while we were putting groceries in the trunk, "I don't understand you, but you always were gentler than the rest." It was not acceptance in the modern, triumphant sense. It was not apology. But it was the first time he described me without accusation. I carried that too. The actual turning point, if I must name one, happened so quietly that I almost missed it. I had come home for a family gathering, one of those crowded late summer afternoons when every room fills with overlapping conversations and old patterns reassert themselves before you can brace for them. My sisters were older then, married, each with children of her own. I had spent the previous year living away, trying once again to inhabit a version of myself that made strangers comfortable. It had exhausted me more than I wanted to admit. That day, while everyone was milling around before dinner, my niece, who was maybe 5, climbed into my lap and asked me why I looked sad all the time in my city clothes. The adults laughed, but I felt the question land somewhere very deep. Children have a cruel and holy way of finding the center of things. Later, when most of the guests had moved outside, my mother came into the kitchen where I was rinsing glasses and said, "You don't have to keep punishing yourself to prove you tried." She said it so matter-of-factly that for a second I could not breathe. I asked her what she thought I was trying to prove. She dried her hands on a towel and looked at me in that same searching, sorrowful way I remembered from the Christmas pageant years earlier. "That you can live as someone who has never fit you," she said. There are sentences that rearrange a life not because they contain new information, but because they remove the last excuse for pretending not to know. After that, everything did not magically become easy. In fact, the months that followed were some of the loneliest of my life, because once I allowed myself to see the shape of my own longing more clearly, I could no longer retreat into vagueness. I had to admit that what I had called crossdressing in my own frightened mind was, for me, never only about clothing. Clothes had been the first language available to a child too young to articulate identity. Grooming had been the daily grammar of recognition. Presentation had been the script through which my family, especially the women, kept telling me who they believed I might be. I had experienced much of it as force because children experience almost everything as force. We do not choose the names, fabrics, rituals, or expectations handed to us. But adulthood required me to sort coercion from revelation, pressure from protection, embarrassment from truth. That sorting took time. It took tears I had postponed for years. It took anger too, because I had to reckon honestly with the fact that being guided before I was ready had left scars, even if the guidance also preserved me. I spoke first with my sisters, one at a time, because they had known me longest in the ordinary details. I expected speeches. What I got were memories. One remembered how I used to calm down only when allowed to sit with the women after family arguments, how I stopped fidgeting the minute someone fixed my hair, or let me help lay out clothes for the next day. The other remembered the summer I had insisted on rough boys' shoes and then cried from relief when she found me a softer pair that still passed without comment at school. Neither of them acted shocked by anything I said. They were not smug about it either, which I appreciated more than I can express. They simply spoke as people who had been waiting, not for confession, but for me to stop speaking around myself. My mother was harder, because with her everything was entangled. Love, control, intuition, fear, and that old family habit of doing first and explaining later. I asked her once, more boldly than I ever had before, whether she had tried to make me into a daughter, because she wanted one more girl in the house. She looked genuinely wounded by the question, then thoughtful, then tired. "No," she said after a long pause. "I think I saw what made you peaceful, and I held on to it too tightly because I was afraid the world would beat it out of you." That answer has lived in me ever since because it is both beautiful and flawed, like most real acts of parenting. She had held on to it too tightly. She had decided things for me that I should one day have decided for myself. But she had also been right about the world.
It did try to beat it out of me.
And some part of me survived because at home there had always been cardigans laid over chair backs, mirrors that did not lie, sisters who corrected my posture toward grace rather than hardness, and women who looked at me and saw not a failed son but a frightened self still forming. The years after that were not a clean before and after. They were full of practical choices, second thoughts, conversations repeated in softer ways, experiments in living that felt less like transformation than recognition. I changed how I dressed, but even that happened gradually, almost shyly. I let myself choose what made me feel at ease instead of what best concealed my instincts. I changed how I moved through family gatherings, no longer hovering guiltily at the edge of the women's world as if trespassing. I began answering to a softer version of my name that had followed me through childhood as a joke and then lingered long enough to become truth. The first time my mother used it without irony, while calling me in from the yard at dusk, I nearly cried at the sound of it. Not because it was perfect, but because it was no longer an accident. People sometimes want to know whether I resent the family that shaped me this way, and the only honest answer is that resentment was part of loving them, just as gratitude was part of surviving them. I resent the silences, the assumptions, the fact that so much of my childhood unfolded through coded gestures instead of clear language. I resent that I had to piece myself together from comments about neatness, prettiness, posture, composure, and what suits you, rather than being given open, spacious words. I resent every time I stood in a room feeling observed rather than understood. But I am also grateful beyond anything simple for the women who refused to abandon the most vulnerable parts of me to shame. My story was not one of dramatic rebellion or theatrical transformation. It was made of ordinary domestic pressure, a brush pulled through my hair, a collar adjusted, a cardigan left waiting, a sister saying you look more like yourself this way, a mother refusing to call my piece by the wrong name, a grandmother telling a mocking man to leave me alone. Those moments, repeated over years, built a bridge I crossed long before I knew I was crossing it. Now, when I look back on my childhood, I do not see a costume drama. I see a household trying imperfectly to protect a child none of us knew how to describe. I see myself learning, slowly and with much fear, that the things which brought me relief were not random eccentricities. They were clues. I see how deeply identity can hide inside the smallest routines of family life, inside. Who gets fussed over, who gets corrected, who gets invited into which room, whose sadness is met with tougher love, and whose is met with tenderness. Mine was met with tenderness, and that tenderness shaped me as surely as any rule could have. If there was force in it, it was the force of being consistently seen in one direction until I could no longer claim I had not noticed. That was frightening. It was also, in the end, a kind of mercy. I still think of that first room sometimes. My grandmother's bedroom with its faded roses and powdery light, my mother standing behind me, hands sure in my hair while I sat very still on the edge of the bed. If I could reach back through time and speak to that child, I would not tell him that everyone around him was right, or that no mistakes were made, or that the path ahead would be easy once he understood himself. I would tell him something simpler and kinder. I would tell him that confusion is not failure, that being shaped by others does not mean you are unreal, that some truths arrive first as discomfort and only later as home. I would tell him that one day he will understand why gentleness felt like recognition and why every attempt to harden himself felt like grief. I would tell him that there is a difference between being turned into something and being led, clumsily, toward what was already waiting. Most of all, I would tell him that years from now, when the fear has quieted and the mirrors no longer feel like enemies, he will be able to look back on this life not as a scandal or a performance, but as the long, intimate education of becoming visible to himself.